Welcome everybody to this webinar Towards a Sustainable Food System, the EU's Role in the Global Transition. I'm Michael Creek, and this is the fourth in a series of webinars that we've been running on sustainable food systems run by SAPEA. So SAPEA stands for Science Advice for Policy by European Academies, and it's part of the European Commission's Scientific Advice Mechanism. So that means working with the group of chief scientific advisors to provide independent scientific advice to European commissioners to support their decision making. And so for this particular webinar, we're delighted to be co-organizing with the HLPE. So the HLPE is the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition. And it's the science policy interface of the Committee on World Food Security, CFS, which is at a global level, international and intergovernmental platform for food security and nutrition. And so the role of both these groups, the chief scientific advisors and the HLPE, is to provide independent, comprehensive and evidence-based analysis and advice for policymaking, including on particularly complex topics like food security. And this year has been a particularly busy one in many ways. Reports, so both groups, there was a strange synchronicity, both groups launched reports this year in March and then in June. And so these, the reports from SAPEA, so there was the evidence review called A Sustainable Food System for the European Union, and then the opinion that was written by the group of chief scientific advisors based on that evidence called Towards a Sustainable Food System. And then at global level, the HLPE produced Food Security and Nutrition, Building a Global Narrative Towards 2030, with, of course, the SDG 2 in mind. So yeah, as I say, this is the fourth in a series of webinars where we've been looking in depth at the evidence and how this informs our transition towards a sustainable food system. And at the moment, things are really hotting up. We're fresh from discussions around World Food Day. There is, of course, the ongoing discussions around the Farm to Fork strategy at European level. And even this week, European Parliament has been voting on the Common Agricultural Policy. So a lot of these questions very fresh in our mind. And we're aware as well that there's a great deal of expertise in the room, both among our speakers, but also we see there's 200 of you joining us now as participants, and we're really curious to hear your questions. But I'd first like to introduce our speakers. So we're very happy to have four speakers joining us. So Karina Keskitalo is Professor of Political Science at the Department of Geography at Umeå University in Sweden. And she is one of the European Commission's 7 chief scientific advisors. Peter Jackson is the co-director at the University of Sheffield's Institute for Sustainable Food, and he chairs the SAPEA working group that produced this report. Martin Cole, so he is head of the School of Agriculture, Food and Wine at Adelaide University in Australia, and he is also chair of the HLPE steering group. Jennifer Clapp, also a member of the steering group, she is Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability and Professor at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And she led the HLPE steering group team that drafted their report.
So how is this webinar going to work for the next hour and a half? So after this short introduction, we're going to hear from Jennifer and Peter. So from one researcher at EU level and one at global level, what does the research tell us about our transition towards a sustainable food system? Next, we'll be welcoming Karina and Martin to talk about how these recommendations can be implemented into policy and what are the connections there between EU and global level. And then finally, in our last half an hour, we'll bring back all 4 speakers to really get stuck into your questions. So here we're really counting on you to submit questions to fuel our conversation. We're aware that there's a great number of experts, both sitting as participants in the webinar as well as speakers. So we really want to make the most of that. So how to interact? We're inviting you to submit your questions in the chat. And If you need any technical support, we also have Toby on hand. So please do use the chat to ask questions or share any comments you might have, any thoughts with the panel and attendees, and I'll bring them into the conversation. We'll also be running a couple of polls to test the room a little bit to see what the appetite is for sustainable food systems and ask you about some of the details. And please note that we're also recording this webinar. So if you have colleagues that might have liked to follow along, you'll be able to send them the link straight afterwards. So please do watch it later on the SAPEA website. Okay, any technical issues? We know WebEx can be a little complicated. Please do first try disconnecting and reconnecting if you lose the sound or image, and don't hesitate to email Toby if you need any technical support. Okay, so without further ado, let's go straight into our first poll. So we're going to bring Jennifer and Peter in to start our conversation, but first, I'd like to ask you, as participants, to what extent do you agree or disagree with this question? So you should see in a little pop-up box the statement, to become sustainable, European food systems need to be radically transformed. And so you have 5 options to show to what extent you agree or disagree. I would like to ask you to submit your answer, and we'll come back to see the results shortly. So that poll will stay open a little while you answer. But in the meantime, I'd like to welcome our speakers, Jennifer and Peter, to hear a little bit more about the findings in your respective reports. So Jennifer, maybe I'll first come to you. So you were working on the HLPE report at global level. What are the points that you would highlight about the evidence presented in that report? So we'll just unmute your microphone. Sorry, just a moment.
Thanks very much, Michael. Sorry about that. It's early in the morning for me. Well, the HLPE report reviews the available data on the state of food security and nutrition, as well as a range of challenges facing food systems today, which point in the direction of the fact that we're nowhere near meeting the SDG 2 goal, which is to end hunger, achieve food security and nutrition, and promote sustainable food systems. So what's striking about the data that we were reviewing in the context of writing this report is there are a number of stark contrasts in food systems that highlight areas of inequity and areas of problems. I'll just maybe, if I have a moment, just give a few examples of those contrasts. I mean, if we look at the face of it, around 1 in 3 people globally faces at least one form of malnutrition. We see 690 million people are chronically undernourished, and that's a number that's increased by nearly 60 million in the 5 years to 2020. Around 2 billion, at the same time, contrast, around 2 billion adults are overweight, including around 650 million people who are obese. And at the same time, we have around 1.5 billion people who are deficient in micronutrients. In other words, they're not getting a diet that provides them adequate minerals and vitamins for good health. So, and many of these categories of malnutrition overlap with each other in really complex ways. And layered on top of the issues around food security and nutrition, we've got serious problems in food systems where food systems are threatened by biodiversity loss and climate change on a global scale. At the same time, that some of the ways we produce food actually contribute to those problems. So a more industrialized production system, for example, emits a lot of carbon and threatens biodiversity. So these are complicated problems. Then we also have a livelihood crisis for many of the world's small-scale food producers, especially in the world's poorest countries, while at the same time we're experiencing or seeing growing concentration among some of the largest corporations that control global supply chains for food. And then when we add the COVID-19 crisis on top of that, it's a really dire situation. There, World Health Organization expects up to 130 million additional people will face acute hunger and food insecurity as a result of the COVID crisis. And I would say the COVID crisis, and we were writing the report as the COVID crisis was unfolding back in March and April. It shines a light on the complexity of global supply chains and especially the vulnerability of food system workers. So based on this evidence, which is, it's like a lot of evidence that we're dealing with, and we were trying to make sense of it in the report, which led us to our main point, which I wanted to stress here at the beginning, because it relates to the question you asked in the poll, is that we do need a radical transformation of food systems if we wish to achieve SDG 2.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, setting out some really stark evidence there to start us out. Peter, maybe I'll come to you to ask about your report at EU level. What are the particular parts of the evidence that you would like to highlight there?
Thank you, Michael. Well, firstly, there's lots of agreement between the report that Jennifer's just summarised and the SAPEA report, for which I was the working group chair. I think we both agree on the need for a food systems approach, a kind of integrated approach, some people say from farm to fork. We also, I think, agree on the overwhelming evidence that suggests that we are currently living beyond our planetary limits, so that the current food system is unsustainable. It follows from that that so-called business as usual is not an option, and that the need for change is urgent, I'd say measured in years or decades rather than in generations. We might also, the report that Jennifer's summarising came out just after the COVID-19 pandemic, and ours came out just before. But I think the pandemic has shown the inherent vulnerability of food systems to a range of shocks, periodic shocks, like the commodity price shocks, 2007, 2008, the climate change, climate crisis, and similarly health pandemics such as we're currently experiencing. So those have highlighted, I'd say, underlying issues of a lack of sustainability rather than being entirely novel. I think just one more thing, and that's that our report spends a lot of time talking about the way power is distributed within the food system and where responsibility for change might lie. So does it lie with industry? Does it lie with farmers? Does it rely with consumers? And so on. One of our conclusions is that there is perhaps too much emphasis on individual consumers and their responsibility for change compared to the wider institutional framework within which individual consumers are situated. So an emphasis on the so-called choice architecture that shapes what we buy when we're shopping, or the institutions that sort of set the rules of engagement, and so on. So we have a kind of an idea about shared responsibilities within this food system. And if I can sneak in one more thing, the other thing I think that the SAPEA report concludes is that the evidence suggests that a mix of so-called hard and soft measures is what we need. So hard measures would include taxation, regulation, and so on, and the softer measures would include consumer education or campaigns and so on. And we think that soft measures alone won't work.
Great, thanks, Peter. And we'll be coming to that a little later on with Karina and Martin to talk about the types of measures and how this can be integrated into policy. But I'm curious as well to come back to the evidence and hear a little more. You've both between you covered a great deal of ground. I wondered if it's helpful just to clarify the concept of a food system, because we hear a lot of complexity. Jennifer, how can we define food systems as we're talking about them here?
Thanks, Michael. Well, food systems really encompass the various elements and activities that relate to the production, processing, distribution, preparation, and consumption of food, as well as the outputs of these activities, including their environmental and socioeconomic effects. And like when we talk about food systems, there are a lot of different models and a lot of different diagrams. If you just Google it, you'll be overwhelmed with different depictions of food systems. But I think the thing that they hold in common is that they're looking at all of those activities that take place, as Peter said, from farm to fork, but also in relation to other systems. So for example, the ecological system on which food systems are based, health systems that connect to outcomes in food systems, economic systems, they're all intermeshed with one another. And there's a complex picture of different forces that can be driving what happens within the food systems, as well as a complex set of relationships on which food systems draw, as well as what they deliver. So it's a complicated picture, and there are different varieties of food systems that we can talk about: the industrial food system, or we can talk about sustainable food systems. But really, they're really talking about those activities from production to consumption and the things around them. And maybe Peter wants to elaborate a bit more on that as well.
I think you've done a good job there, Jennifer. I agree with all of that. I think one of the things the public find hard to understand, though, is the connections between, let's say, farming and biodiversity, or between food and health. So one of the things the food system approach tries to do is to make those connections and to recognise potential trade-offs. So, for example, we might want cheaper food for those living in food poverty, but cheaper food might rely on unsustainable practices in terms of lots of additives in food or highly intensive industrialised forms of production. So I think the food systems approach is trying to look at the complexity of the food system, but also show not just that it's complex and too hard to comprehend, but to think about the links between various parts. And that's particularly important because lots of interventions are kind of single issue interventions, and the food systems approach tries to guard against that, to try to eliminate perverse effects or unintended consequences from particular policy interventions. So I think there's a strong academic consensus now in favour of food systems thinking, and there's still less consensus about what to do about that in policy terms. And I think that's where our two reports take the debate forward.
Right. And I'm curious to come back to this point you made, Peter, about the balance of power within these food systems and the emphasis on the power of the individual. Jennifer, I was wondering if you'd like to draw on that a little more in the evidence from the HLP report.
Right. Well, there is, as Peter noted, there is a lot of imbalance in terms of the power and influence of different actors within food systems. And if we're talking about these activities from production to processing and distribution, retail and consumption, clearly different actors are prevalent in these different parts of food systems, but a lot of the decisions that get made about what crops get produced or what foods are produced, how they're produced, with what kinds of inputs, how they're going to be marketed, a lot of those activities are actually determined more by economic and corporate actors, and consumers kind of have to deal with a lot of choices that other people made at the end of the day. And that sort of takes, I would argue, takes away a bit of the agency of consumers, because it's in the hands of other more powerful actors. So when we take a food systems approach, it's really important, as Peter noted, to sort of take note of where along food supply chains, for example, different actors have different levels of influence, and a more participatory approach that gives more agency or that is more distributed with, because as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of concentration going on in agri-food supply chains. It's becoming much more pronounced, especially in recent decades. So if we think about redistributing towards more small and medium scale enterprises for distribution as well as for production and processing, this can open up more agency for smaller scale actors.
Okay.
Yeah, jump in there too.
Yeah, please do.
A couple of things I'd like to add. I agree with all of what Jennifer said. One is that looking at power asymmetries means you look at where corporate control of agricultural production, for example, or you look at the extent to which retail is highly concentrated. So in the UK, for example, about 80% of our grocery shopping comes from the 4 main supermarkets, and that gives us, that gives them tremendous power within the system, although they would say they're reacting to consumer demand. The other thing I think this question of thinking about power within the system leads to is to try and challenge the very common view among politicians and among media and so on, that somehow consumers are to blame for what goes wrong in the food system. And a couple of examples of that would be allegations that consumers don't know how to cook from scratch, so rely on convenience food, or that consumers are profligate in relation to food, and that generates a lot of food waste. And there is a lot of social science evidence that contradicts that so-called deficit model, that if only consumers behaved themselves, followed government advice and guidance, that all would be well. And there's, as I say, a lot of evidence that suggests that we need to think about individual consumers, but within a much wider framework of institutions and the context in which they work.
Right, and there's actually a relevant question come up in the chat there, relating this to the farm to fork strategy. So a question from Tobin Robinson, who is asking, is farm to fork now insufficient? A systems approach should look to a much broader context, at least, including waste management and the wider environmental impact. Can we conclude that from the point you're making?
I would say yes, although it's important to say that the Sapea report collected evidence and then, if you like, handed the baton over to Karina and the group of chief scientific advisors to draw policy recommendations from our evidence. But certainly I would suggest that there was a lot of emphasis on consumer choice, informed choice, consumers as individuals with responsibilities in the farm to fork strategy that I think is, I'd say, unbalanced. And I also think there's an argument to be made about which of the recommendations in the farm to fork strategy are obligations and which are guidance. But as I say, I'm stepping slightly beyond the evidence here into more policy debate, and I think Karina will probably return to this in the next session.
We'll definitely get into it. Jennifer, I wondered if you had any thoughts on this and maybe the differences. I mean, of course, these food systems are all interlinked at European and global level, but are there some differences that you would highlight looking at your report at global level?
Differences between the European and global food systems.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, as you noted, they are enmeshed with one another in really complicated ways. But when we look at a global scale, in terms of addressing the problems in food systems and thinking of ways to get beyond those problems, I think the picture is quite complex at the global level, simply because we're dealing with a lot more countries, a lot more regions of the world. We're dealing with much sharper diversity in terms of income and wealth. And I think we're also looking at a more fragmented governance landscape at the global level. So if we're talking about problems in food systems at the global scale, it's perhaps a little bit more challenging than at the European scale, simply because we're dealing with a greater diversity of actors, and we're dealing with a situation where there's, like in the EU, you can have regional level policies and approaches, whereas at the global level, it gets a bit more difficult. The Committee on World Food Security, for example, can offer policy advice, but it's really up to governments at that global scale to take on those policy recommendations and implement them. And it's not always straightforward, as I said, because of these vast disparities in income and wealth and situations facing different parts of the world. And and global supply chains are really complex. I know a lot of, obviously, European Union countries are engaged in some of these global supply chains, but I think that's just a maybe slightly messier and a much bigger picture at the global level.
Does that chime with your view on things, Peter, this increased diversity and complexity?
Yes, it does. Although, of course, the EU has plenty of regional differences and national and other cultural differences within it. But I think Jennifer's right. I think the EU has some. It's a powerful actor in the global system, and it has some specific policy instruments at its disposal, such as the Common Agricultural Policy or common fisheries and so on. So it has some specific instruments it can use. But of course, it's working within a wider set of institutions and, if you like, global rules set by the World Trade Organization or the UN Law of the Sea, or softer measures like the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think the two reports are different in their emphasis. I think the HLPE report places more evidence on hunger and malnutrition at the global scale, whereas the E report talks more about sustainability and health. And of course, that's not to say that hunger and malnutrition are not issues in the global north and in the EU as well. But I think the two reports are different in their emphases because of that set issues about scale and geography.
Mm. And something else I noticed about the difference in approaches within the reports is in the HLPE report, you talk about a right to food approach. And I noticed in the SAPEA report, there's more an emphasis on food as a common good. Jennifer, could you clarify a little bit? Are these similar approaches?
Yeah, I do think there are similar approaches, and having read the underlying reports that Peter based his reports work on, definitely connected ideas. And the right to food, I mean, we're simply, well, for the HLPE, this is a fundamental starting point for the work of the Committee on World Food Security and the high-level panel of experts. The right to food is recognized as a fundamental human right to be upheld by states, and it was recognized in the 1948 Universal Declaration on Human Rights and reaffirmed in a number of internationally agreed statements and documents since that time, including the Right to Food Guidelines in 2004. The reason we start with this right is because we are operating and providing advice within an international body housed within the United Nations, and that right to food is a central idea. Yet, the right to food is not being adequately upheld, as we know, because the data show that we're not close to meeting SDG 2. And so that's where one of the other big recommendations or ideas that come out of the HLPE report is that we need to widen our understanding of food security. And we went back to some of the original documentation around the right to food to show that there are other concepts that help us to understand food security even within those legal documents. So not to take too much time, but for example, a lot of the existing literature and policy documents point to what we call these 4 pillars of food security. That would be availability. Is there enough food? Access, can people acquire it? Utilization, is food healthy and nutritious? And stability, are markets free from volatility? Well, we actually say those are really important elements, but when we go back into the legal understandings of the right to food, there are other elements that we want to bring forward. One of those is sustainability, and I know that's a really big concept in food as a common good. And the sustainability question is really, it's asking that question, are we going to be able to provide food now as well as for future generations into the long future? That raises all kinds of questions about the ecological relationships with food. And we also highlight agency as an element of the right to food, as well as food security more broadly. And that's simply the question, are people able to make their own decisions and determine their own relationships with food systems? These, as we know, people who are facing the most marginalized situations and are struggling with food security often are those that have the least agency in society. So we try to bring these together and say these 6 dimensions are really important, not just for food security, but also for achieving the right to food. And I know that sustainability and agency they're really important issues and concepts as well that feed into food as a common good. But I'll let Peter speak to that.
Yeah, there are plenty of related questions also coming in, but I would like to hear from Peter. We'll get to the questions perhaps in our last half an hour.
Okay.
But yeah, Peter, do you have some thoughts on this food as a common good compared to right to food? And I wonder also if you could touch on, I think there is sometimes a criticism or a perception that these types of approaches are based more on values than on evidence. And I wonder if you had some thoughts on that too.
Okay, I'll try and roll those 2 questions into one. I think both reports start from the position that how we frame food makes a very big difference to what we do in response to the current challenges to the food system. So the HLPE report talks about different narratives and favours the right to food. The SAPEA report talks about a number of different framings, including the right to food, but also food as commons and a couple of others besides. But I think they're all united in the sense that they pose a challenge to the dominant view of food as commodity. So just like any other good that can be bought and sold. And clearly food is much more than that. It has enormous cultural value. It's literally a matter of life and death. It's something we incorporate in our bodies and literally becomes part of ourselves, and so on. So that framing question, I think, is common to the two reports. I think the main difference between food as right and food as commons is that food as right is kind of enshrined in specific global agreements right back to the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights from the 1960s. And albeit that hasn't been developed in practice in some countries, but there is that notion that it's there enshrined in law. Whereas food as commons, I think, is a, if I can put it this way, a slightly looser idea about how food is valued and how it might be managed better consensually for the common good. So the second part of your question was about, isn't this all about values rather than hard evidence? And the Sapere report will push back strongly on that. And it's really important, I think, in our report that we're talking about arguments and analysis for which there is a strong evidence base. Almost everything in our report is based on the peer-reviewed literature. And I think it's a common misunderstanding, if I can put it as strongly as that, of social science, then it's all just about opinion. Someone says this, someone else says that. And it's really important that social science challenges that misunderstanding and talks about the evidence base for what we're saying. And that's particularly important in a policy context, because there is a boundary, I think, between the analysis of policy options and policy outcomes and the advocacy of particular policy positions. And that's why the scientific advice mechanism, of which Sapere is a part, suggests that there should be evidence gathering over here, done by academics appointed independently by the European academies. And then the next process, which is where the group of chief scientific advisors takes the argument forward in terms of its scientific opinion, which more directly relates to policy and allows itself to speak more freely in terms of recommendations.
Brilliant, thanks. Well, you've made the link very nicely to the next step of the webinar, which is to come and talk about this policy approach. But thank you both very much, and we'll be inviting you back in half an hour as we can see, the questions have been flooding in, so we'll have plenty to talk about in half an hour's time after speaking to Martin and Karina. So thank you both. Let's come back to our polls. So looking at the results of the first poll, we asked, to what extent do you agree that to become sustainable, European food systems need to be radically transformed? Most of you agree or strongly agree, with a tendency towards agree, and only very few, only 7 people clicked disagree. Okay, it seems that there is resounding support for a push for radical transformation of European food systems. I'm curious to ask another question, and this is to ask, which of these levels will be most important in ensuring a sustainable food system in Europe? Local level, regional level, national, European, or global? And of course, we're aware that, as we said, all of these levels are interlinked, but here we want to push to suggest which you think will be most important in ensuring this transition to a sustainable food system. And we'll look at the results in just a moment, but in the meantime, I'd like to invite our speakers, Martin Cole and Karina Keskitalo, to join us. And so here we'll be hearing a little bit more about the HLPE, how the evidence presented in the report that Jennifer talked about can be integrated into policy. And likewise, at EU level, how can the Sapere evidence review report and the opinion which came from it then move into European policy? So Martin and Karina, feel free to put your cameras on and join us back. There we go, great. So thank you, both of you, for joining us. Karina, maybe I can come to you first and ask you to pick out, what would you say are the highlights of the recommendations in the advisor's scientific opinion?
Right, thank you. And thank you for having me here at this webinar. I hope you can hear me fine.
Yep, great.
So I think actually Peter has said most of the things, the main points I wanted to stress. So I'll go through the the main recommendations we have, as you will see, they are very well in line with the Sapir report, which they build on, and then take this step further that Peter also spoke about. So the main recommendation, the first one we make, is to make environmental, social, and economic sustainability the central objective of all policies relevant to food. And this actually goes further than it might seem. It might seem as if it's just words, but it actually speaks to this framing to understand that if you see something in a specific way, you're likely to regulate it in that way or treat it in that way. And that's, of course, as Peter said, it's not an issue of values, it's really an issue of research. You can see that this is the way it is. So if you want to treat an issue differently, you have to first frame it differently. And this then goes into the second recommendation, ensure a truly integrated approach to bring about a sustainable food system. So that's then really about, how do you make sure that you treat food in other ways than only as a commodity. So then we recommend, for instance, to adopt an active stepwise policy transition, to integrate sustainable food systems thinking into existing sectoral policies. This may speak a bit to some comments that were made in the chat about the need to, how to measure sustainability. And here we don't suggest to measure it. We mainly suggest that, if you actually integrate more and look at the effects in more areas, then hopefully you move more towards sustainability. And of course, since this is me reflecting on issues in the chat, it's not exactly in the report, but I'm trying to interpret and, respond. It's the same with the question on how do you then take into account the much broader context, including waste management and wider environmental impact? Well, if you actually look into existing sectors and try to go beyond, the very narrow perspective, then this would be a way to start moving towards that. And then the EU could, as we suggest, take a leadership role to support this sort of transformation, being that the EU is such a big or large body, can work through trade and development policies and so on, but also build on what works in different countries. Someone wrote about different food cultures and so on. And of course, there's also different national and regional cultures in what works and what doesn't. So we also suggest that once you really look at pilot initiatives that exist in different countries and consider maybe for upscaling or, also recognize the large diversity. And I think some of these points Peter has made already, there's a huge need to address power and information asymmetries, the sort of food environment or choice architecture, not just assume that consumers will make the right choice if they get the information. There's so many other things that influence what and how we eat. And for that reason, maybe increase the policy focus on food manufacturers and retailers, so not just on producers and consumers, which have been the most highlighted groups, strengthen more vulnerable actors, and as Peter has also said to that, and then combine different measures, look at voluntary means as supplementary rather than as being main drivers. So I think those are the main recommendations. And they speak then to some of these points. Someone asked in the chat that agency models are just as much influenced by political ideology as other, as being accurate. So there was a question in the chat about this. And I think actually these reports speak a bit to that, saying that it's not just assuming that people will be able to act or be able to participate if they're provided some small role. It's really saying that one has to look at people's existing motivation structures and understandings in policy and work with these. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. That's a nice overview of the various elements in the recommendations. Martin, I'd like to hear, so you're chair of the HLPE steering group. Could you give an overview in a similar way, perhaps, of the policy recommendations that your report made?
Sure. Look, and what I thought I'd do, Michael, is just in general terms talk about the kind of. I think there's some really good agreement between the reports. I think in the policy space there's a really good agreement. I think for the need for radical transformation and this sense of urgency. I think there's a good recognition that there's different levels of policy at the global trade level. Obviously, that's a global issue. Agricultural policy, that could be at the EU level, and then there may well be national level, particularly public health roles. There's also, I think, a very good recognition in this idea of moving things quicker, this idea that local food policy can actually be a good case study that people can learn from, and the ability to do that in terms of driving transformative change. there's this, I think, a common element around the balance, generally that there's a need for more coercive instruments in terms of driving change, but in balance with other things in terms of trying to drive consumer behavior.
What would be coercive instruments in this case?
Taxation, for example. Yeah.
Sure.
Regulatory aspects, trade policy. But I think there's also in that light, there's also, I think, throughout both the policy recommendations, there's a good recommendation that probably it's going to take multiple policy means to drive the sorts of things we're talking about. And then really there's also a general theme around the need that any approach probably is it's a complex thing to drive, and it's a complex thing so we need, any approach has to be iterative, and any approach really, we need the means to be able to monitor change. So I'll just finish up by just highlighting there's 4 policy drivers that the HLP came up with, and then there's an enabler. Now, just to kind of finish on that. So really, I think the first policy driver, and what we're saying is that the 4 policy drivers really are where we came up with to really make a difference in terms of the dimensions of food security that Jennifer talked about, including importance of agency and sustainability. So the first one is just recognize in setting policy, recognize the need for radical transformation. This is where the right to food comes in, sustainability comes in, and really strengthening the role of state in food systems to better support all the 6 dimensions now of food security. The second policy driver is recognize that food security and nutrition really needs to be, and we've had this discussion already, needs to be interconnected with different systems and different sectors. Look at the issue of COVID-19 we're dealing with at the moment, where you've absolutely got to be looking at what you're doing from a public health aspect in terms of agriculture and food policy. Otherwise, we're going to have a big food security issue from COVID-19. The third one is around, let's recognize that the broader implications of hunger and malnutrition in all of its form. We've got this, perverse world that we're in where, we've got 690 million people going to bed hungry, but we've got a global obesity epidemic. And the role of food in health is massive, of course. Then the fourth policy driver is and this is also comes out through the EU reports, is the need to make sure that policy is context specific. And so, in the different layers of policy instruments, we need to make sure that we need diverse solutions. And then under enabling conditions, we need to, I think globally, we need to improve governance. If we're really serious about making a difference, then we need to have governance improvement at different scales. And also the research piece is really important. I mean, I always say if we've got the ability these days to be able to model a global climate, well, why can't we model the global food supply? Imagine if we could do that. We could use it for foresighting, and we could also use it for monitoring progress against different policy levers. So that's kind of just where I'll finish there for now.
Great, thanks. So yeah, the importance of solid evidence there to support this, all this complexity in policymaking. Karina, I wonder if I could come back to you and draw on one of the questions that's been submitted in the chat. Caroline Kalinius made the comment, please reflect on diversity of food systems and within the food systems. Would this help towards reaching more sustainability and we're not losing out in the current times globally? So this question of diversity, the European Union is extremely diverse. How can we make policy work with all the cultural diversity we see across member states?
Right. I'm trying to see this question. I can't really find it, but I did hear what you said. So, of course, this is a general problem, I guess, of all EU policymaking. And of course, we are aware with Water Framework Directive, all sorts of these large directives. This takes a long time and several cycles to do things. And you also have to get agreement at EU level, and then you can't require things at absolutely won't work with different national systems. So it's a limit in how, so you have to be rather broad in requirements in directives, for instance, if you talk about that. What you can do, of course, is, put forward what you can put forward, try to build bridges both at the EU level and lower. And in the opinion, of course, we also recommend that, you have to build on local initiatives, local and regional, different initiatives, and as I mentioned earlier, that deal with different food cultures and regulative cultures, because some things will work in some environments and not others. And this relates both to regulation and what foods people eat. And so you have to take into account both diversity and open up for bottom-up initiatives, but not just in the way of opening up for them in a general way, but building on what is there, seeing if it can be upscaled or maybe used as a good practice elsewhere, but also couple this with, actually showing that this is an issue to take seriously, maybe with incentives and so on.
Absolutely.
That's an answer.
Thanks very much. Yeah, Martin, I was curious to ask you about how you see the connection between what Europe is doing and what's happening globally. What role, how do you look to Europe when you're making policy at global level?
Yeah, look, I think, that's a really good question, particularly in the environment that we're in at the moment, globally. You have to question, where is the leadership going to come from? Obviously the HLP recommendations, as Jennifer has unpacked, really needs to be, cognizant of a global environment and the diversity there. But I think we're all looking at the same evidence, and actually a lot of these issues know no borders. And so I think, look, there's a real opportunity for the EU to take a leadership role in many of these global issues. To be honest, I can't see. I'm struggling to see where a lot of the leadership's going to come from, and so I wouldn't underestimate the role of the EU in actually brokering and leading global change. We certainly need that sort of leadership at the moment. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really key question. That's why I was particularly pleased. I think we're in almost violent agreement across these reports. Obviously, the emphasis is different within the EU, but I wouldn't underestimate the role of the EU in driving both, obviously changes at the EU level, driving best practice, showing how to really make that transformation, but then also taking a global, leadership role in terms of showing how to do things.
Okay, so an opportunity for the European Union to step up and take a leadership role. Karina, how do you see this? Do you think the EU is likely to step up and take this role?
Well, I guess that's a question for the EU leadership and Parliament and so on. But we have seen some things. We've seen the Green Deal about environment, but filtering into multiple areas, and of course about sustainability and food as well. We have the Farm to Fork. And there are some questions in the chat about, are these sufficient, and or what's happening with the CAP and Green Deal enough, and so on. And of course, one can also, and this is sort of me reflecting as a political science professor rather than anything that's directly in the opinion, some things you can't change immediately, maybe, and because farmers are built into a specific system, it may be difficult to change one thing from one day to the next. There's a huge debate here in Sweden now about some changes in the CAP, because people have built their farms in a specific way. But on the other hand, also radical change can be incremental. It can be lots of smaller incremental changes. And by incremental, I don't mean minuscule, I mean smaller. You can build up over a period of maybe 5 to 10 years. So hopefully then you can sort of move towards change, and hopefully the EU wants to move towards change, because the EU certainly at least has possibilities. We write about this in the opinion. Of course, it can work on its own internal market, trade and development policies. We suggest that it can make full use with its capabilities in all policy areas, where it can legislate and adopt binding acts. And this is both exclusive and shared competences, and this includes a lot of areas: agriculture, rural development, fisheries, mariculture, international trade, competition, bilateral trade agreements. So certainly there are ways to do things.
Sure.
If the framing is there, maybe.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So Martin, Karina has talked through some of the challenges that we're facing at European level. What about at global level? What do you see as the main barriers to this transition towards a sustainable food system?
Well, I think even before COVID-19, we're not, as Jennifer said, we're not on track to meet Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 2 in this case. But and we've got whenever we have a crisis like COVID-19, it certainly emphasizes the differences in terms of the different vulnerabilities. So I think the what we're seeing around the world is very, very different, vulnerabilities in terms of food security, particularly those areas of the world that are already kind of food insecure. So I think the challenge is to, particularly, we've got lots of countries that still very, kind of dependent on imports for food security. And yet we've got, in times of crisis, there's a tendency to develop protectionist trade policies. And I think what we need to do is we need to be looking at, in addition to looking at, national trading bloc areas, we also need to, we need to be looking at how we can influence change at the global level, because if we don't, as I said, all of these issues really know no borders. So that's the issue, is just the dichotomy of the maturity. For taking COVID-19 as a very good example, the first wave that went through countries that had a rather mature supply chain and sophisticated health service. Now, as the pandemic has gone into less developed parts of the world, we're seeing kind of much more impact in relation to food security, resilience of the supply chain. So we need to be cognizant of different. I think that's what Karina was saying. We do need to be very cognizant of different. It needs to be context specific. So around the world, we have very different food systems. We know that smallholder farmers still provide a lot of the diversity in terms of micronutrients and stuff like that. But there's broad. We need to be looking at broad agricultural policy as well, around incentivizing healthier diets as well. So a lot of our incentives are aimed at the big staples. And so one of the things we need to be looking at, as well as being context specific, is we need to be looking at those policy and trade incentives to drive healthier food supply outcomes. So major challenges to enable this globally. But again, I think don't underestimate a trading bloc like the EU and the role that they could play in showing some best practice and driving some change.
Great. I'm keen to bring in some questions as well from the participants. I see this one from Karen Fabry, who comments that action is clearly needed at all levels, from global to local. But since things need to also happen on the ground, where people actually live and work, can the EU urban agenda play a role and focus some of its efforts to support food systems transformation in towns and cities across the EU? Karina, I wonder if you have some thoughts on this.
Sure, definitely. And this is the sort of type of approach we recommend in talking about this, as I mentioned earlier, this active stepwise policy transition to integrate sustainable food system thinking into sectoral policies. Is we're looking at the very different, of course, this is almost an impossible task because food is in everything, and food and transport and energy, but really to think, once you look at re-regulating or making changes in a policy area, thinking what impact would this have on food. We work on the food issue as well. The food is not only about the rural agenda, it's also about the urban and cities agenda, definitely. And this is the general recommendation to look across sectors. So definitely.
Great. Thank you both for your thoughts. I'm going to ask you to stay on the line for a moment, and in just a moment we'll bring back Jennifer and Peter to continue the conversation and look at a few more of the questions being asked. But you brought up the issue of Europe playing a leadership role, and it's interesting to see that in the poll that we ran, we asked which of these levels you think will be most important in ensuring our transition to a sustainable food system in Europe. And actually, the one that you've participants watching have deemed the most important is the European level. So interesting to see that you think people here think that the action needs to happen first at European level, global and national level a little behind, and then local and regional, the lowest priority, or the levels at which people think that this transition is least likely to take place. So interesting to hear your thoughts. I'd like to ask one last poll question before we bring back Jennifer and Peter to look at the questions from participants. And so now I'm asking, which of these strategies do you think will play a greater role in ensuring a sustainable food system in Europe? And we've given only 3 options, although we know we could have added more. So the first is incentive-based policies, such as taxation. The second is raising public awareness. And the third is coercive policies, such as regulation. So I'm curious as well to hear your thoughts there. Again, we know that all of these play a role and many other elements are crucial as well, but we're curious to hear your thoughts on those 3. So again, we'll come to the results in just a moment. But first, I'd like to bring back Jennifer and Peter. So please do put your cameras on. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the conversation is progressing. Peter, maybe I'll come to you first. Did you have any comments on the points that Karina and Martin brought up?
Of course. I have just, let me do 2. One was the question that came up in the chat as well about diversity, and that's a key part of the SAPEA report, which is about recognising diversity within and beyond Europe. So that might be in terms of urban and rural differences, questions of cultural heritage, percentage of the population in different member states employed in agriculture and so on. And a good place to look for what we might do in relation to that recognition of diversity would be in the penultimate chapter, which is about the good practice examples we identify. And some of those are single nation. So we looked, for example, at the Danish whole grain partnership as a very effective dietary intervention. Another was the UK Sustainable Food Cities Network, and some were local and some were regional and so on. So that chapter of good practice examples is a really interesting range of things, of practical interventions, where there is, again, peer-reviewed evidence that they've been effective. So it's not just sort of wishful thinking, it's where there's some firm evidence. So that's the diversity question, which I think is critical. And incidentally, in relation to the previous poll, I think what was interesting there was not just that the EU level kind of won, but that there was a support for all levels. So different people were thinking all local, regional, global. So it's certainly true that there was a winner to the poll, but the range of different levels and their interconnections will be really important. And then, sorry, the second thing I wanted to say was in relation to COVID-19, which we've all agreed, I think, sort of highlights underlying vulnerabilities within the food system. And the kind of question in the chat was, is this not also an opportunity as well as a threat? And I think we could certainly see the way in which even temporarily empty shelves drew attention to just-in-time delivery systems, the very large number of people who are now in food poverty and need emergency food aid who were not previously in that situation. And even things like the shift in the food provision from food service or restaurants and bars and so on, which have had to close or had their hours reduced, to people getting more of their food from supermarkets. All of those things, I think, have highlighted issues within the food system. And I think they're part of this debate that, at least in the UK, is called Build Back Better. So there's an argument that rather than just having a kind of resilient food system that returns to the status quo, doesn't the COVID-19 pandemic indicate the need for transformational change?
Great, thanks. Yeah, you've covered a lot of ground there. It's great. Jennifer, I'm curious to hear your thoughts as well before we bring in some of the questions from participants. Were there things that sprung to mind as Karina and Martin were talking?
Yes, definitely, quite a bit. I'll just make 2 points, similar to what Peter did. Just to say also that when Martin outlined in terms of policy recommendations from the HLPE report, focusing around the 4 key policy shifts of the need to recognize transformation in food systems, take into account interconnectedness of different systems, address all forms of malnutrition, and put forward context-specific solutions. Those 4 policy directions that Martin outlined arose out of the evidence that we presented in the report, where we were outlining examples of where policy shifts in those kinds of directions actually worked to make a difference. And although there is a lot of evidence out there of these kinds of policy shifts happening, what we found in our review of the literature was that they're not necessarily being consistently applied together in a coherent way. And we show that those 4 policy shifts, when implemented together, can really push us more towards transformation of food systems, towards more sustainable and equitable outcomes. And so although those are policy recommendations, they actually arose directly from the evidence and data that we looked at in terms of the report, and that came out of both policy experience and policy documents, as well as the scholarly peer-reviewed literature. So I just wanted to make that point. And then also just to pick up on a question that I saw in the chat about, I think it might be the same question Peter was responding to, about whether COVID, how is it going to affect these debates on transformation in the food system? And I would say it actually, as tragic as the outcomes are, it's very serious. I think it does provide an opening for a more fruitful and interesting conversation about transformation, simply because COVID did shine a strong light on some of the inequities in the system, the fact that food system workers are highly vulnerable, the fact that global supply chains are very fragile in the face of this kind of disruption, and that our food systems generally are very, very wasteful, the way that we organize things. And so I think that it does provide an opening for that kind of conversation, but it also brings in, there's those of us in our report included, we point to the need, for example, to think about more local and regional market and distribution systems, which we call territorial markets in the report, as well as agroecological production systems, which are less wasteful, and et cetera. And the reasons we bring those ideas forward is because they help to achieve all of those dimensions of food security, including agency and sustainability, empowerment, healthy and sustainable, because they're diverse and they provide more livelihood opportunities for more people, especially for the marginalized. But at the same time, I know that in the broader discussions, we're seeing people putting forward other kinds of arguments for how we transform. For example, big data in agriculture. In other words, farming without people. If there's a crisis, maybe we can just farm without people. Or big digital systems for distribution. So there are very different models on the table for what that transformation could look like. And in our report was sort of just as the pandemic was unfolding, and we didn't get a chance to explore those debates between these kind of big different viewpoints about how transformation can happen. But I think it's a really important conversation that we do need to continue to have. Great.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Any more thoughts, Karina or Martin, before we come to some more of these questions? Maybe I'll just
one there, Michael, on this aspect of national sovereignty versus global stuff. I think the way that we looked at it in the report was certainly that obviously the right to food is a fundamental human right, it's inseparable from social justice, and that you'd argue that of all the things, actually feeding people is one of the primary objectives of any government in terms of, and it's part of national sovereignty. But I think the issue is that, we've got, given the complexity and interconnected nature of food and nutritional security issues and their impact on both public and planetary health, and the fact there's no borders there, really not only does that reinforce the importance of international coordination, but also you could argue that, in order for governments to fulfill their own sovereign responsibility to feed their people, they've really got to lean into it at a global level too. So that's kind of, there was a question there on the chat line. That's the way we looked at this national sovereignty versus a global responsibility.
Yeah, I'm just reading that question. So that was the one from Volker Wachtler. The question was, may we hear your views on the conflict between a strong EU leadership role and the respect for sovereignty of non-EU countries? I wonder if any of the others of you have thoughts on that same question.
Sure.
Karina?
Yeah, I can just say something, and this is again maybe just, we haven't written explicitly on this in the opinion, but maybe so a reflection from a political science professor. Of course, the EU will steer whatever it does as soon as it's in connection with, in existing trade deals or bilateral policy or development policies or whatever it might be. So it steers anyway, and it will have an impact. So then the question is more, how do you assure that this steering is somehow equitable and pays attention to non-EU countries? And hopefully this will be built into the system, but there will be a steering impact, whatever is done. And of course, one can hope that countries will not join, trade deals they don't see as relevant. And this is the general, realist picture of international relations. So hopefully then, we have to move towards sustainability. Countries have their sovereignty. The EU will attempt to steer. Hopefully it will steer in a better way rather than not. And there are lots of existing possibilities if we actually do act based on different framings. I also see someone has written to me that there are also problems with protectionist food policies and trade limitations that reduce food security. These are issues that have to be taken into account. So, but this is an open question for the politicians. Thank you.
Absolutely. Another question that's
question as well, Michael.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Volker's question is a really important one. I think because strong leadership from the EU doesn't mean riding roughshod over national sovereignty, whether that's in the EU or beyond. So I think the EU's leadership role extends to thinking about its role within the wider global economy. And a specific example of that would be in the early 2000s when the EU changed its sugar regime in terms of tariffs and so on. It had a devastating set of consequences for people in the ACP sugarcane producing countries. And those kind of global, I'm a geographer by training, so I'm kind of tuned into that notion of connections between what happens in one location having implications elsewhere. So I think it's not an either or, EU strong leadership versus sovereignty of non-EU countries. I think that's part of the EU's leadership role.
Great. Thanks very much. I'd like to move on to another question. There was, and it's one that you touched on, Karina. I think you picked it up a little bit in one of your points. The question from Tobin Robinson about how can sustainability be meaningfully measured? What are the units we should be using to compare options? How to measure sustainability? Jennifer, I'm guessing that you have some thoughts on this.
Sorry, I was just writing the question down.
No worries.
Well, it's a very difficult thing to measure. I think what is important is to, first of all, think about what different indicators help to give us an insight into whether food systems are sustainable. So because not everything can actually be measured. So we need to draw on what we can, but be careful about what it all means when you add it all up. But we need to look at carbon, we need to carbon emissions, we need to look at biodiversity and crop diversity, loss, soil health, water availability. Like there's a whole range of indicators that can help us to understand whether or not food systems are crossing, planetary boundaries or the biophysical capacity of the earth to support food systems. But sustainability as we point out in our report, and as many would argue, is not just those environmental indicators. Sustainability has to incorporate social and economic dimensions as well. And the way we look at sustainability in our report is to sort of stress that it's important that food systems be able to provide food not just for today, but also to maintain that economic, social, and environmental base on which food systems need to produce food going into the future. So agreed, it's difficult to put one indicator on sustainability. I think we have to bring together a number of different aspects and make a value call. And I would just to touch briefly on your comment about values and evidence and science. Yeah, I mean, all data needs to be interpreted, and when we interpret it, we bring values to it, and that's in a sense what our global narrative report tried to do, is to bring forward that interpretation based on values such as the right to food, which is embodied in legal definitions, but also within the broader literature of these wide aspects of sustainability, which does encompass that sort of social, economic, and ecological dimensions.
There was another related question actually that came up on that question.
Sorry, Michael,
yeah, please do.
Can I quickly add to that as well, in the conversational spirit that we're
Go for it, yeah.
I think metrics are absolutely crucial, but they go back to what we were saying at the beginning about food systems. So you could have a measure of biodiversity or CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions or soil quality or whatever. But you also, as Jennifer's just said, need to think about the human consequences of that and issues of equality, inequality, equity, and so on. And one of the ways I think that we can do that within a food system framework is through scenario building. So you can think of a sort of business as usual model rolled forward and what the outcomes of that would be for a series of measures. But you could also then start to think, well, what if we valued food in a different way, or what if we met various climate targets or whatever. So the kind of work that Tim Benton's been doing on scenario analysis is something we mentioned in the SAPEA report, and I think is quite a good way of looking at not just single issue measures and metrics, but the way in which different, tweaking one part of the system has a series of consequences that you can map through the system. And I think Martin was saying the same thing as well, is, why can't we have some kind of system mapping that's as subtle and complex as we have for the climate change, for example?
Great, thanks. I wonder if I can bring in a question here. I wanted to mention, first of all, that there was a related question from Stig Larsater, who said that the findings from my own research points to the fact that agency models are just as much influenced by political ideology, for example, neoliberal concepts such as the sovereign consumer, as an accurate or science-based description of actual power relations or agency in actual value chains or food systems. How to deal with that. So I hope that some of the points that you've both made there are examples of how we can ensure that these models are really evidence-based and not only influenced by political ideology. Just wanted to touch on that.
Karina?
Please do, yeah.
Just to say, I mentioned something short about this earlier, and I think what this author means is that, assuming that there will be a sovereign consumer is actually sort of ideology. This idea that if you just provide information, then people will change, and they change. This sort of rational man and change directly based on information. I mean, we know that this is not true. And in the same way, there are many things one might want to assume, which are not true, and which are, I think, very well taken up in the SAPEA report. I mean, for a long time, there's been this movement towards sort of new environmental governance tools, which have to a large extent been voluntary. And there was this hope for at least the last 20 years that these will, solve the issues. People will voluntarily do what is right. I think this is also one of the things that the SAPEA report shows, that this is also ideology, and not because it's from social science. It's not, rather it's, a broader trend that has been sort of assumed, that people have then researched and found that this is not the case. People will not change voluntarily just like that because they get better information. That's the same case with the consumer that doesn't. So I think we actually try to do a pretty good job of recognizing this in both the SAPEA report and the opinion. And the same with that, it's not enough to say that, participation, develop participation, because all of these things will be obstructed by existing power relations. That's the same point with, steering and sovereignty. We have a number of power relations in this field, in any field, honestly. And this is really what both the Sapir report and the opinion very well recognize, I think, and saying that you have to work recognizing and through these power relations, for instance, working on the parties which have so far not been so strongly regulated in the food system, and seeing how can you do that. It doesn't take away the power relations because they are there, but it tries to, shift the balance. I think this is really, important to discuss. How much do we actually build on science and how much is assumption? And these reports are really building on science rather than taking the assumption that people are, rational actors or sovereign consumers or these type of things. So I hope we address that. Thank you.
Great. Martin, I want to bring you in there, but I want to throw in as well a question, a very much related question from Yanea Pencha, who mentions that the researchers explained their approach extremely clearly. But can you comment on the ability for the uptake of those messages by policymakers? She asks, do they hear the messages? So yeah, to me, there's a connection there, Martin. Can we make sure that this complexity in the research is really implemented in policy?
No, and look, I think that's the key question here. I mean, I'm a really, kind of, I'm a kind of glass half full guy, So I think we've got, so despite having massive challenges, I think the human race is amazingly innovative and creative. We have some amazing technology and innovations that we know can solve the issue. I think that the issue is that this is a very complex space. We need to move it into the solution space. We need to be, but we need, in any kind of change management, you think of this at a global level, this is a massive change management project. And in any change management project, you need to have some good metrics that show, as Peter was saying, you need to be able to do the foresighting. If we pulled this lever, what would be the effect on the system? But also, this is really important in terms of bringing everybody along. We need to be able to monitor progress and to see, not just a lag indicator in terms of how many people are starving, but we need some lead indicators that indicate, the adoption and how we're tracking with that, and are different policy measures being implemented in the right way within the right time frame. But also, we've got, as well as policy and government influence, we've also got to, appreciate the power. This is head and heart stuff. We've got to bring the consumer, there's a new generation of consumer. It's the rise of the ethical consumer. So don't underestimate the power of our next generation to really say, well, actually, I really want to do the right thing, because, this is going to be, in the future, this is going to be their planet. So I think we need to, as well as the government policy and implementation, don't underestimate the consumer power here in terms of actually wanting to do the right thing.
Okay. Yeah, there's been lots of conversation in the chat about these concerns of the ethical consumers. A good example here from Steph Bronsweier, who points out that global food demand is rising almost exponentially, while Farm to Fork pushes for a 50% reduction in pesticides, among other things. How can we produce more food in a safe manner? And I think that sums up a lot of the concerns about the food system here. Who would like to take this one?
I can try.
Please do.
Karina here. And this is not an answer, because I think no one has the actual real answer. We had a previous opinion called Food from the Oceans, which started off in this concern at DG Mare. And there we actually looked at, how can we get more foods out of the oceans in a sustainable way? And this actually deals a lot with that, you have to eat other stuff than what you've been used to. I mean, in Europe, we don't eat very much algae and seaweed. In Asia, they do. This is something that sort of rather produces itself and is rather easy to grow. I think people who worked on the previous SAPER report informed that opinion. They usually said that, it's easy to fertilize in the ocean because the fertilization flows past. You don't have to fertilize, it comes past. You just have to plant. I mean, it's very different systems. They also had this difference that, what we've been eating that comes from the sea is largely the top predators, which are, the dragons, the things that don't exist in, food chains on the ground. So what we have to learn to do is to eat in lower food chains, algae, seaweed, mussels, which also are very easy to grow, beneficial in water, all these type of aspects. So we have to learn to eat different things and also grow different things, and maybe co-capitalize on how we grow them, having mussel farming developments on infrastructure in the sea and these type of issues. So there's actually lots of ideas. So that was actually promoted by another EU DG that was very concerned about this issue. So there are multiple answers, and not all of them are, terrestrial, for instance, which is what we often talk about.
Thanks, Karina. Peter, I was going to say, I'm sure you have something to say on this.
Sorry, is it? Okay, thank you. I'm going to give a rather academic answer to the question about ethical consumption. And I have long discussions with my students about the difference between self-consciously ethical consumers who might engage in fair trade, for example, who still remain a very small proportion of the overall food purchasing, for example, and what I like to think of as consumer ethics. We all have an ethics behind our consumption, and that shouldn't be confused with those people who are campaigning and self-consciously ethical. So any food system has to face ethical dilemmas over animal welfare, over the difference between local consumption, alternative food networks, our responsibilities to distant strangers, like I was talking about before in relation to the sugar regime. So I think there's quite a useful distinction to be made there. We tend to focus on a minority of consumers who are, if you like, a vanguard and very important for that. But we shouldn't do that to the exclusion of thinking of the ethical issues that we all face day to day in relation to what we choose to buy or indeed not to buy. Michael, you need to unmute, I think.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Jennifer, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo some of the things that Karina said as well about feeding a growing world with food and done so sustainably. There's actually a lot that we need to put into that kind of equation. It's really complex, as Karina noted, but in addition to the fact that dietary change can make a huge difference. So we need to understand or remember as well that around 1/3 of all food produced is actually wasted. And reducing that waste is really important. But I wanted to stress as well, there are production systems, because the question included the recommendation to reduce pesticide use. There are production systems that can make production more resilient against pests and drought and other stresses, and do so naturally without external chemicals. So agroecology is just one example of this kind of production approach. And I think, a combination of things like dietary change and things that Karina mentioned, as well as reducing food waste, in addition to changing production systems, can go a long way, because we already produce more calories globally per person than we could possibly eat on a daily basis. And while much of these calories might be going into biofuels and into waste and into feeding animals, etc., the fact remains we are producing an enormous number of calories every year, every day, for every person. We just need to think about how we're going to channel what we produce and how we produce it. And I do believe there are ways that we can reduce that environmental impact, still reducing chemical use, but enabling us to meet food demand.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jennifer. We're running rapidly out of time. Time has absolutely flown by this last hour and a half, but I want to give each of you a chance to give some final thoughts before we wrap up. Just a chance to put across the message that you would like everybody watching this to take home or maybe anything that's come to mind looking at the questions and the discussion, points that a final point you might like to make. Maybe I can come to Karina first.
Right. Yeah, I'll try to, I guess this is also more the reflection of a political science professor, but it's also very much a highlight, I think, in the Sapir report and subsequent and also in the opinion. I mean, we have to really recognize the role of power. And this is what social sciences really do, I think, understanding the power within different frameworks, not assuming it's not there, but asking how can we address it. So I think social sciences, which is both the basic of the Sapir report and the opinion, can really address the how question. How can you start regulating? And I've also noted that, of course, the opinion and mainly the opinion and make a bit more specific and maybe more pedestrian suggestions than the other report we've had here today. But I think that's also because it deals so much with the how question. You know, how could we actually start? It's the framing, it's the reviewing regulation, it's the thinking about how we see consumers and how we see instruments and what instruments we choose to really think about how can we shift then the power in the system. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, the tricky power dynamics. Thanks. Martin, what about your final thoughts on this point?
Yeah, so having been kind of optimistic earlier on, I also think there's this sense of urgency. So I think what we do in the next 10 years is absolutely crucial. You're seeing signs that the system is really under a lot of strain. You know, we had a major reform after the last world food crisis, 2009. We had a major reform of the UN system. I think in the last 10 years since that, we've had amazing, our understanding of the complexity of the food supply chain and food security issues has been really fantastic. But if the last decade has been about increasing our understanding, this coming decade absolutely has to be about an acceleration and an implementation of policy and innovations to solve the issue. Thanks.
Yeah, so 2030 looming large on the horizon. Yeah, the urgency of taking action. Thanks. Peter, what about you? What struck you from this conversation?
Thank you for the opportunity for a last word. I think we need to demonstrate the power of food systems thinking. We need to integrate environmental and social science perspectives on the problem. And I think in policy terms, that means we need to urge for more concerted and consolidated action from government at all levels, but also from NGOs and civil society. So I think we're faced with a very fragmented political landscape, but I think, as others have said, there is a real opportunity for the EU to lead here. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. And Jennifer, a final word from you as well.
Right, well, I agree with everything everyone's already said. So, but I would say that the thing that the sort of big message that I come away with from the work that we did in this conversation just now is just the enormous inequities that exist in the food system right now, and those power imbalances that Karina mentioned, and also the unsustainability and the urgency of dealing with that, as Martin brought up as well. And I think that the lessons out of that are some of the key messages of our HLPE report, which is that we need to empower those people who are most marginalized and vulnerable within food systems, and we need to really put sustainability at the center of transformative action going forward. So yeah, in our report, we give some examples of what some of the policies are, and we touched on those a little bit briefly here, but I think that dealing with inequities through empowerment and dealing with unsustainability through more regenerative agricultural production and distribution systems, I think, is the key.
Okay, thank you very much to the four of you for all your insights into how we can make this transition towards a sustainable food system a reality. We really appreciate all your input. It's been interesting as well to see in the polls in the background which strategies you think will play the biggest role in ensuring this transition. It seems that 34% of you, the biggest percentage, opted for coercive policies such as regulation, incentive-based policies such as taxation, and public awareness were less highly prioritized. So it seems that you're on board that action needs to happen, that this sense of urgency, the complexity of the food systems that our experts have raised here is very much chiming with our participants. Thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to all 200 of you that joined us from all over Europe and from all over the world. It's been a really interesting discussion, and one that I think will continue to run and run. We at Sapere, we're very interested in keeping this conversation going. As I said, this is the fourth in a series of webinars, and we'd like to invite you all, if you're interested in hearing more about COVID-19, which we touched on, and our food. We had a very interesting discussion earlier on with Anna Davies and Aoife Allen from Hubub. You can find these recordings on the website. And likewise, for our webinar on the EU's Farm to Fork strategy, and a more recent one on food policy at a time of crisis. We have two more coming up, so we'd love to welcome you back to keep the conversation going. And please keep an eye on the Sapere website for next events. As we said, this webinar itself will be recorded and will be hosted there too. Please do subscribe to the Sapere newsletter to keep up to date. And we'll be circulating a feedback form as you close this webinar. You should receive it. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on this discussion and any future discussions you would like to participate in. So a massive thank you to everyone, and looking forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Thank you.